I was in the middle of stacking hay when I saw her. A sleek, silver SUV rolled up my gravel driveway like it owned the place, tires crunching over the stones with an air of entitlement. I wiped the sweat off my forehead, resting my pitchfork against the barn wall, already sensing trouble before the driver's side door even opened. And then she stepped out, pristine white blouse, perfectly ironed slacks, and a clipboard clutched tightly in her manicured hand. I knew exactly who she was before she even spoke. Oh, Eleanor, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, the tyrant of perfectly manicured lawns, and the woman whose mere presence made reasonable men feel an immediate migraine coming on. She didn't walk toward me. She marched, each step filled with the kind of confidence that only came from years of pushing people around and getting away with it. I barely had time to process her arrival before she was standing in front of me, looking around my barn like she was assessing property value, her nose wrinkling as though the very air of my land offended her. "You must be the owner," she said, eyes scanning me from head to toe as if my dusty jeans and work boots were an act of personal disrespect. "That's right," I replied, keeping my tone calm but firm. I'd lived on this land long enough to know that HOA drama was like a fire. Give it oxygen, and it would burn everything down. "What can I do for you?" She pursed her lips, tapping the clipboard with her French-tipped nails. "We're holding an emergency HOA meeting tonight, and after reviewing all possible locations, we've decided your barn is the perfect venue." I blinked, certain I had misheard her. "My barn?" "Yes, your barn," she said, as if repeating it would somehow make it sound less insane. "The community has spoken, and we need a large, enclosed space. The clubhouse is under renovation, and quite frankly, the other homes in the neighborhood aren't suitable for this kind of gathering." I folded my arms. "That's real interesting, considering I'm not part of the HOA." Her expression didn't change. She smiled, tight-lipped, predatory, the kind of smile that made a man instinctively check his wallet. "That's just a technicality." I let out a sharp laugh. "No, it's not. It's the difference between me having to listen to your nonsense and me telling you to get off my property." She blinked, seemingly unaccustomed to hearing the word no. Then, in a move that would have been impressive if it weren't so ridiculous, she lifted her clipboard and pulled out a sheet of paper, holding it out like a royal decree. "We've already sent out the announcement," she said. "People are expecting to meet here. It's really in everyone's best interest if you cooperate." I took the paper from her, glancing at what had to be the most unprofessional, legally dubious document I'd ever seen. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Notice of temporary community venue allocation." Below that, a single paragraph claimed that due to unforeseen circumstances, my barn was now an official HOA meeting location. There was no legal jargon, no signatures, just a poorly formatted attempt at intimidation. I let the silence drag, watching her shift uncomfortably as I pretended to consider it. Then I folded the paper neatly and shoved it back into her clipboard. "Not happening." Her mouth tightened. "I don't think you understand the importance of this meeting." "Oh, I understand just fine," I said. "What you don't understand is that this barn is private property. It doesn't belong to the HOA, it belongs to me. And the only way a meeting is happening in there is if I'm the one calling it." She huffed, adjusting the pearl necklace around her throat like it physically pained her to be denied. "We've already made arrangements." "That's your problem." She glanced toward the barn, her jaw tightening as if she were weighing her options. Then, with a slow, patronizing smile, she said, "I don't think you realize how uncooperative this makes you look to the rest of the community." I raised an eyebrow. "Lady, I don't care what the HOA thinks of me. You can take your meeting, your clipboard, and your fake authority and march it right back to wherever you came from." Her nostrils flared. For a second, I thought she might actually try to argue, but instead, she let out a sharp exhale and turned on her heel, striding back toward her SUV with all the fury of a queen whose peasants had just staged a rebellion. She yanked open the door, paused, and looked back at me. "You'll regret this," she said, voice dripping with menace. "One way or another, this meeting is happening." Then she got in, slammed the door, and sped off down my driveway, tires kicking up a cloud of dust in her wake. I watched her go, rubbing a hand down my face. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I didn't know what kind of power trip she was on, but I had no doubt she was already scheming up a way to get her way. And that's when it hit me. If she wanted to play dirty, I could play dirtier. A slow grin spread across my face as an idea formed. A ridiculous, over-the-top, absolutely foolproof way to ensure that this so-called emergency HOA meeting would become the worst decision of her life. I just needed a few dozen ducks. I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing around my property, thinking of ways to handle the situation without escalating it into something that would require lawyers. It was clear that Eleanor wasn't going to back down, and if I knew anything about her type, she had probably already told half the HOA that the meeting was confirmed. Ignoring her wouldn't work. She would just show up with her army of rule-obsessed neighbors and force the issue. Telling her off again might feel satisfying, but it wouldn't solve the problem. No, I needed something better, something that would make her regret ever stepping foot onto my land. And that's when the idea struck me like a lightning bolt. Ducks. Not just any ducks, but a full-fledged army of them. Angry, territorial, feisty ducks. I had a friend, David, who ran a small poultry farm a few miles out of town. He specialized in raising all sorts of birds, from chickens to turkeys. But what made his farm unique was his gaggle of highly aggressive ducks. These weren't the docile, pond-floating kind. These were farm-hardened ducks that had been raised to defend their territory from anything that moved. I had heard stories about them chasing off trespassers, attacking delivery drivers, and even terrorizing a group of rowdy kids who tried to steal eggs from the farm. If there was ever a time to weaponize ducks, this was it. I grabbed my phone and dialed David. He picked up on the third ring, his voice already filled with suspicion. "What do you want?" I grinned. "I need some ducks." There was a pause. "How many?" 50. Another pause. 50 ducks? What the hell do you need 50 ducks for? I explained the situation, giving him the short version of Eleanor's attempted takeover and my plan to turn her meeting into a disaster she'd never forget. By the time I finished, David was laughing so hard I thought he might drop the phone. "You are absolutely out of your damn mind," he said, still wheezing from laughter. "But I love it. When do you need them?" "Tomorrow evening. I'll handle transportation. Just have them ready." David let out a long whistle. "You realize these ducks are mean as hell, right? They've been raised to chase anything that doesn't belong. That's exactly why I need them." "All right, but don't call me when they turn on you." I assured him I had everything under control and hung up. Now all I had to do was prepare the barn. I spent the next few hours setting the stage for the ultimate HOA nightmare. First, I reinforced the barn doors to ensure they could be shut and latched from the outside once Eleanor and her crew were inside. I didn't want them escaping too quickly. Next, I spread a few piles of hay in the corners to give the illusion that I had prepared the space for them, just enough to make Eleanor believe she had won. The real magic, however, would happen when I released the ducks. By the time the sun set, I had run through the plan a dozen times in my head, making sure everything would go off without a hitch. I knew Eleanor wouldn't show up alone. She'd bring her most loyal HOA members, the kind who would rather walk on broken glass than challenge her authority. That meant at least 15 to 20 people crammed into my barn, all expecting a professional, orderly meeting. What they would get instead was absolute chaos. The next morning, I picked up a rented livestock trailer and drove out to David's farm. The moment I pulled up, I was greeted by the sound of quacking, loud, aggressive, and relentless. The ducks were already restless, sensing that something was about to happen. David stood by the pen, shaking his head as he watched them. "You're insane," he muttered as I approached. "I prefer the term strategic," I said, grinning. With some effort, we herded the ducks into the trailer. It was like trying to control a stampede of miniature, feathered bulls. They flapped, squawked, and bit at anything within reach. One particularly large drake nearly took a chunk out of my glove before I managed to guide him inside. By the time we were done, my arms were scratched up, my shirt was covered in feathers, and David was still laughing at my expense. "You better have a camera rolling for this," he said as I climbed into my truck. "Oh, don't worry," I replied. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." I drove back home, keeping my windows rolled up to avoid the overwhelming noise coming from the trailer. The ducks were not happy, and that was perfect. They needed to be agitated, restless, on edge. By the time I pulled up to the barn, they were already at peak aggression. I backed the trailer up to the side entrance, carefully positioning it so that when the time was right, I could swing open the doors and let the chaos unfold. I made sure the main barn doors were open just enough to make it look inviting, reinforcing the illusion that I had given in to Eleanor's demands. Then I waited. As expected, she arrived right on schedule. This time, she had a caravan of HOA members following behind her, all dressed in business casual attire like they were about to attend a city council meeting instead of an illegal takeover of private property. Eleanor stepped out of her SUV, beaming like she had already won. "I'm so glad you came to your senses," she said, not even bothering to ask if she had permission. I shrugged. "Figured you'd just keep pushing until you got what you wanted. Might as well make it easy on myself." She smirked, turning to her followers. "See? Reason always prevails." I bit back a laugh. She had no idea. She led her group into the barn, inspecting everything with a critical eye. "It's a little rustic, but it'll do. We'll begin shortly." I nodded, stepping back toward the side entrance. The trailer was positioned, the latch was ready. The only thing left was the final touch. As Eleanor took her place at the front of the barn, clipboard in hand, I reached for the latch and pulled. The trailer door swung open, and 50 furious ducks charged into the barn. The first thing I heard was Eleanor's scream. The second was the collective panic of the HOA members as they realized they were trapped in an enclosed space with a stampede of enraged waterfowl. Feathers flew, people tripped over each other, stumbling in their rush to escape the flurry of beaks and wings. A particularly bold duck snatched Eleanor's clipboard right out of her hands, flapping away with it as she shrieked in horror. I stepped outside, casually locking the barn doors behind me. The HOA wanted a meeting. Now they had one with the ducks. The moment the ducks stormed into the barn, chaos erupted like an explosion of feathers and pure panic. Eleanor's confident, smug demeanor shattered in an instant, replaced by shrieks of pure horror as 50 furious ducks flapped, pecked, and charged at anything that moved. The HOA members, dressed in their carefully pressed blouses, slacks, and dress shoes, were completely unprepared for the feathery assault that had just taken over their so-called meeting space. The first to fall was a man in khakis and a sweater vest, who let out a strangled yelp as a particularly aggressive duck latched onto his pant leg and refused to let go. He stumbled backward, flailing his arms as more ducks swarmed around him, pecking and honking in a deafening chorus of mayhem. The other HOA members tried to run, but the barn was packed too tightly, and every movement only seemed to enrage the ducks further. Eleanor herself was at the center of the disaster, spinning in circles with wide, panicked eyes, slapping at the ducks that kept leaping at her. One managed to snag the edge of her expensive silk blouse with its beak, yanking hard enough to make her stumble. Another flapped wildly into her face, sending her shrieking backward until she tripped over a bale of hay and landed flat on her back. Her clipboard, the same one she had waved so smugly in my face, was now in the possession of a victorious duck that had grabbed it and taken off toward the rafters. The HOA members who weren't already on the ground were desperately trying to find an escape route, but I had made sure the only available exit was the main barn doors, still slightly ajar, but blocked by a few strategically placed barrels. They could get out eventually, but not without some effort. In the meantime, the ducks had full control of the battlefield. A woman in a pastel cardigan made a break for it, pushing past 2 other HOA members, but a duck launched itself at her feet, causing her to trip forward into another member. They both went down in a tangled mess of flailing limbs, and the ducks wasted no time taking advantage of their vulnerable state. Feathers rained down, beaks pecked relentlessly, and the honking, the ceaseless, ear-piercing honking, reached levels that could probably be heard across the entire neighborhood. Eleanor finally managed to scramble to her feet, her hair disheveled, her blouse wrinkled, and her expression an absolute mix of rage and terror. She locked eyes with me through the gap in the barn doors, and I saw the exact moment she realized what had happened. "You," she screeched, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "You did this." I casually leaned against the barn wall, arms crossed, enjoying the spectacle before me. "I told you the barn wasn't available. You should have listened." "Listen." She tried to storm toward the door, but the ducks had no intention of letting her leave so easily. One particularly large drake positioned itself directly in front of her, wings outstretched, hissing like a furious demon. Eleanor hesitated for just a second too long, and that was all it took for the duck to launch itself at her. She let out a horrified shriek, stumbling back once more, arms flailing as she tried to bat it away. The other HOA members weren't faring any better. At this point, most of them had resorted to sheer desperation, trying to climb over the barrels near the exit while fending off the relentless duck assault. One man, whose polo shirt had been stained with something unidentifiable, was waving his arms like a madman, trying to fend off 3 ducks that had seemingly decided he was their personal enemy. Another woman had completely given up, curling into a ball on the ground as the ducks circled her like vultures. The honking continued, growing more intense as the ducks fully embraced their reign of terror. They weren't just attacking, they were enjoying it. It was as if they had been waiting their entire lives for this moment, and they were determined to make the most of it. Eleanor, now realizing that there was no way to regain control of the situation, finally pushed past 2 of her equally distressed HOA followers and made a break for the barn doors. She shoved one of the barrels aside and squeezed through the gap, her once pristine appearance now completely ruined. Her blouse was torn, her expensive jewelry was askew, and there were feathers stuck in her hair. As soon as she was outside, she spun toward me, panting heavily, her face red with rage. "This is an act of sabotage," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You think this is funny?" I pretended to consider her question for a moment, then nodded. Yeah, I do." Her nostrils flared, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. Behind her, the rest of the HOA members were still trying to escape the barn, each one looking worse than the last. "You're going to regret this," she snarled, jabbing a finger toward my chest. "I will make sure you pay for this. The HOA has no jurisdiction here." I cut in, my voice calm but firm. "This isn't your property, it's mine. And you and your little crew of rule enforcers just trespassed, tried to take over my barn, and got exactly what you deserved." She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could get another word out, a final duck, one particularly brave, bold little creature, came sprinting out of the barn and lunged at her ankle. Eleanor let out one last, ear-piercing shriek and leaped backward, tripping over her own feet and landing unceremoniously in a puddle of mud. The HOA members who had finally made it outside stood frozen for a moment, staring at her as she sat there covered in dirt and feathers, gasping for breath. And then, as if realizing how utterly ridiculous the situation was, a few of them started to laugh. It was quiet at first, just a chuckle here and there, but then it spread, growing louder and louder until the whole group, minus Eleanor, was doubled over, struggling to breathe through their laughter. Eleanor, humiliated beyond belief, pushed herself up, trembling with fury. "This isn't over," she spat, her voice shaking. "You'll regret this." I grinned, watching as she stormed toward her car, her shoes squelching in the mud with every step. "Oh, I don't think I will." She climbed into her SUV, slamming the door shut so hard that it echoed across the yard. The remaining HOA members, still chuckling to themselves, slowly dispersed, some shaking their heads, others giving me nods of approval. As Eleanor's car screeched out of my driveway, I turned back toward the barn, listening as the last few ducks finally calmed down, their mission complete. I had won, and Eleanor? She would never, ever forget this day. Eleanor's SUV disappeared down the road, leaving behind a group of bedraggled, humiliated HOA members and a barn that now belonged to the ducks. I stood there for a moment, watching as the dust settled from her hasty retreat, listening to the last few honks of my feathery enforcers as they strutted around, victorious in their conquest. The air was thick with the lingering scent of hay, feathers, and sweat, and if I wasn't mistaken, there was an underlying hint of Eleanor's perfume mixed with the unmistakable smell of failure. Some of the HOA members were still brushing themselves off, picking feathers out of their hair, muttering amongst themselves. A few of them avoided my gaze entirely, pretending as if they had no idea how they ended up in this mess, while others exchanged hesitant looks, as if reconsidering their loyalty to Eleanor after witnessing her downfall. One man in a polo shirt, who had spent the last 10 minutes trying to scrape duck droppings off his shoe, finally sighed, shook his head, and trudged away without a word. I knew Eleanor wouldn't let this go. People like her never did. She had been publicly humiliated, and I had no doubt that her mind was already racing with ways to turn the situation in her favor. She would paint herself as the victim, the poor, unsuspecting HOA president who had been maliciously attacked by a rogue barn owner and his army of unruly livestock. She would call for consequences, demand retribution, and try to find a way to drag me into whatever HOA nightmare she thought she could manufacture. I wasn't worried. By the time the last of the HOA members had made their slow, defeated exit, I was already preparing for round 2. I had security cameras around the barn, footage of Eleanor trespassing, footage of her declaring my property as her own, footage of her attempting to force an illegal HOA mandate on me. And most importantly, I had an entire town of witnesses who had just watched her get taken down by a flock of enraged ducks. I took my time gathering my things, stepping into the barn to check on the aftermath. The hay was a mess, feathers were everywhere, and a few overturned chairs lay abandoned near the center of the space. In the corner, the clipboard-thieving duck stood proudly atop a pile of scattered papers, still clutching its prize in its beak. I considered taking it back, but decided the duck had earned it. After making sure everything was secure, I locked up and headed inside my house. I didn't have to wait long before the first sign of retaliation arrived. An hour later, my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and smirked. It was exactly who I expected. I answered with a casual, "Hello? Do you think this is funny?" Eleanor's voice was shaking with barely contained rage. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I leaned back in my chair, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Yeah," I said. "I do." "This is harassment," she screeched. "This is vandalism. I have half a mind to call the authorities and report you for endangering an entire HOA meeting." I laughed, genuinely amused by her desperation. "Go ahead, Eleanor. Call them. Let me know how that works out for you." There was a long pause, and I could almost hear her gritting her teeth on the other end. She knew exactly why she couldn't call the cops. She had no legal grounds. She had trespassed, tried to strong-arm me into complying with an illegitimate demand, and then got publicly humiliated when her plan backfired. If she brought the authorities into this, she'd only be digging her own grave deeper. Instead, she tried a different approach. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," she hissed. "I have influence in this community. People respect me. Do you really think this is over?" I stretched my legs out, feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. "Oh, I know it's not over," I said. "I expect you'll be back with some other ridiculous scheme soon enough. But Eleanor, let me give you a little advice." Silence. I could tell she didn't want to hear whatever I was about to say, but she couldn't help herself. "You tried to take something that didn't belong to you. You thought you could bulldoze your way in here and dictate what happens on my land just because you're used to people rolling over for you. But you made one big mistake." "And what's that?" she snapped. "You underestimated me." I hung up before she could respond, setting my phone down with a satisfied sigh. For the next few days, I waited for her next move. I knew she wouldn't just slink away quietly. People like Eleanor never did. They had to have the last word, the final act, the ultimate revenge. And sure enough, it wasn't long before I started noticing the small, petty ways she was trying to get back at me. First, there was the anonymous complaint to the local zoning office claiming that my barn was being used for illegal gatherings. That one didn't go far, considering I had security footage proving that it was her, not me, who had tried to turn it into a community center. Then came the mysteriously slashed tires on my truck one morning. Amateur work and nothing a quick call to a repair shop couldn't fix. But the real kicker came when I heard about the emergency HOA meeting she scheduled, this time at the proper venue, the community clubhouse. According to my friend who still lived in the HOA, the agenda was clear, a motion to have me officially disciplined for my actions. Of course, the problem with that plan was simple. I wasn't part of the HOA. When the meeting took place, I didn't bother attending. I didn't need to. The outcome was inevitable. Half the HOA members who had been present in my barn that day were still recovering from the horror of what they had endured. Some of them had already turned against Eleanor, blaming her for the whole ordeal. She had lost credibility, lost respect, and most importantly, lost control. A day after the meeting, I got a call from my friend in the HOA, laughing so hard he could barely get the words out. "Eleanor's furious," he wheezed. "She tried to get them to pass some kind of disciplinary action against you, and half the room just walked out. Nobody's taking her seriously anymore. She's become a joke." I smirked, leaning back in my chair. "Sounds like a personal problem." She looked like she was about to explode. I've never seen her that mad. I swear, if she had a chance, she'd probably ban ducks from the entire neighborhood. That mental image alone made the entire ordeal worth it. By the end of the week, Eleanor had gone completely silent. No more phone calls. No more complaints, no more pathetic attempts at revenge. Whether she had finally admitted defeat or was simply biding her time, I didn't know. But for now, the barn was mine, the HOA had backed off, and the ducks, my glorious, chaotic enforcers, had secured their place in history. I stood outside that evening, watching as the last rays of sunlight bathed my property in a golden glow. From the barn, the occasional honk echoed across the land, a reminder of the battle that had taken place. Eleanor had learned a lesson she wouldn't forget anytime soon, and if she ever decided to try her luck again, well, I had a feeling the ducks would be ready. The morning after Eleanor's failed HOA meeting, I stepped out onto my porch with a fresh cup of coffee and took in the peaceful silence of my land. The air was crisp, the sky painted in soft hues of dawn, and for the first time in weeks, there wasn't a single trace of HOA nonsense lingering over my head. No entitled demands, no trespassing committees, and best of all, no Eleanor. The barn stood exactly as it should, quiet, except for the occasional rustling of hay and the satisfied quacks of the ducks who had become the unexpected heroes of this entire fiasco. I took a slow sip of coffee, savoring the victory. The town was still buzzing with talk of the infamous Duckageddon, as some had started calling it. Apparently, someone had caught a few snippets of the chaos on their phone, and the footage had been making the rounds on social media. Eleanor's flailing, the absolute terror on the faces of the HOA members, and of course, the fearless duck that had made off with her clipboard had become legendary. Even the local news had picked up the story, though they framed it as a lighthearted community mishap. I knew Eleanor had to be absolutely seething about the whole thing. For the next few days, I expected some kind of retaliation. Even with her credibility shattered, Eleanor wasn't the type to let things go. She had spent years ruling the HOA like a queen on a throne, and having that power stripped away so publicly had to be unbearable for her. But the days passed, and there was nothing. No more phone calls, no more passive-aggressive letters in the mail, no more surprise visits. By the end of the week, I started to hear murmurs around town that Eleanor had taken a leave of absence from the HOA. Apparently, she claimed she needed time to recover from the emotional trauma of recent events. I wasn't sure if she actually meant it, or if she was just trying to avoid the people who now saw her as a complete joke. Either way, it meant one thing. She was out, at least for now. With Eleanor temporarily out of the picture, the rest of the HOA members seemed to take a step back from their usual level of enforcement. I noticed fewer people walking around with their little notepads, jotting down infractions. The ridiculous warnings for mailbox height violations and grass length discrepancies stopped appearing on people's doors. It was as if without their leader, they had no real motivation to keep up the act. One afternoon, I ran into my neighbor, Tom, who had always been one of the quieter members of the HOA. He waved me down while I was hauling a few bags of feed to the barn and walked over with an amused grin on his face. "You really did a number on Eleanor," he said, chuckling. "I don't think I've ever seen her so humiliated in my life." I shrugged, setting the bags down. "She brought it on herself." "Oh, no doubt," he agreed. "Honestly, I think a lot of people were just looking for an excuse to push back against her. Nobody ever liked the way she ran things, but she had this way of making people too scared to speak up. After what happened at the barn, though," he let out a low whistle. "Let's just say people are starting to rethink a lot of things." I raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Tom scratched the back of his head. "Well, for starters, there's talk about getting rid of some of the more ridiculous HOA rules. The whole thing with mailbox colors, the lawn inspections. People are realizing it's all just busy work that Eleanor used to keep control. Without her breathing down everyone's necks, there's not much reason to keep enforcing that nonsense." That was an unexpected but welcome surprise. I had assumed the HOA would eventually regroup, elect a new leader, and continue their usual antics. But if they were actually considering cutting back on their ridiculous rules, that meant the community might finally get some breathing room. "Guess that means you guys won't be needing my barn for meetings anymore," I said with a smirk. Tom laughed. "I think everyone's learned their lesson about trying to take over your property. No one's going to forget that anytime soon." Over the next few weeks, I watched as the ripple effect of Eleanor's downfall spread. Without her constant meddling, the HOA started losing its grip on the neighborhood. More and more homeowners began pushing back against old restrictions, questioning why they had to keep their fences at a certain height or why they needed approval for minor home improvements. It turned out that once people realized they didn't have to be afraid of Eleanor, they weren't afraid of the HOA either. And then the best news of all arrived. I was coming back from town when I noticed a moving truck parked outside Eleanor's house. At first, I thought maybe she was just redecorating or replacing furniture, but then I saw her standing on the front porch, arms crossed, watching as movers hauled box after box out of her home. I slowed my truck, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when Eleanor suddenly turned and spotted me. For a brief moment, we just stared at each other. Then, with a look of pure loathing, She spun on her heel and disappeared inside. I sat there for a second, then let out a low whistle. She was actually leaving. I didn't know if she had been forced out by embarrassment, if the HOA had finally turned on her, or if she just couldn't stand living in a neighborhood where her authority had been so publicly destroyed. Whatever the reason, the fact remained the same. Eleanor was gone. I rolled down my window and called out to one of the movers. She moving out for good? The guy wiped his forehead and nodded. Yeah, sold the place fast. Didn't even stay on the market long. I grinned. Well, that's the best news I've heard all day. With Eleanor out of the picture, the neighborhood finally started to feel like a place where people could actually live without being micromanaged. The HOA still existed, but without her iron grip, it functioned more as a suggestion box than a ruling government. People started painting their houses the colors they actually wanted. Someone put up wind chimes, and nobody complained. Someone else planted a row of sunflowers in their front yard, and instead of receiving a violation notice, they got compliments from their neighbors. As for me, I went back to enjoying my land, my barn, and my feathered army of defenders. The ducks, now local celebrities, had settled into their routine, waddling around like they owned the place, which, in a way, they did. One evening, my friend David stopped by with a case of beer and a knowing smirk. "So, what's next?" he asked as we sat on my porch watching the sunset. I took a long sip, feeling nothing but satisfaction. Nothing. Things are finally how they should be. He chuckled. No more HOA battles. No more ducks. I smirked. Oh, I'm keeping the ducks. You never know when they might come in handy again. We both laughed, watching as a few of them waddled up to the porch, looking as smug as ever. Eleanor was gone. The HOA had lost its teeth. My barn was mine, and the ducks? They were ready for whatever came next.